In the heart of North Carolina, a quiet, unassuming woman named Blanche Taylor Moore would come to be known as one of the most notorious figures in the state's history. Beneath her charming exterior and soft-spoken demeanor lurked a deadly secret. A secret that would shock the community and leave a trail of death in its wake. This is the chilling story of Blanche Taylor Moore, aka the Black Widow, a convicted murderer and suspected serial killer whose crimes would haunt those who would cross her path. Welcome. I'm John Cordray, a licensed mental health therapist, and today I will be analyzing one of the oldest known serial killers, Blanche Taylor Moore. I will provide my speculations, not a diagnosis of Blanche. This is Inside Killer Minds. Blanche Taylor Moore was born on February 17, 1933, in Alamance County, North Carolina. Blanche seemed to lead an ordinary life. Her father, Parker D. Kaiser, known as PD, was a fire and brimstone preacher, delivering passionate sermons that portrayed him as a righteous man of faith. However, behind the pulpit and away from the public eye, the reality of Blanche's home life was far different from the image her father projected. PD struggled with alcohol and gambling, and it cast an evil shadow over the family. His actions, driven by personal demons, created an atmosphere of tension, hardship, and trauma. As the fifth of 7 children, Blanche witnessed and experienced the trauma of living in a household marked by her father's volatility. The family was caught in a cycle of fear and instability as PD struggled to maintain control in private while presenting himself as a man of God in public. Blanche's childhood reflects the complexities of trauma, growing up in a home where appearances often hid deeper issues, and the impact of such an upbringing was felt by all members of the family. Blanche married young, started a family, and worked as a cashier at the local Kroger grocery store. By all normal accounts, Blanche was a normal American housewife with a seemingly normal life. But behind a facade of normalcy, there were signs of trouble. Blanche's father died in 1966 under mysterious circumstances. His death, initially attributed to a heart attack, would later be re-examined with suspicion. As investigators would eventually uncover, this was just the beginning of a disturbing pattern in Blanche's life. Blanche's first husband, James Napoleon Taylor, was a veteran and a furniture restorer who provided for his family. Together, they started a family, welcoming 2 children, one in 1953 and the other in 1959. In 1954, Blanche took a job as a cashier at a local Kroger grocery store. Her dedication and hard work paid off when in 1959 she rose to the position of a head cashier. But Blanche's life was far from picture perfect. In 1962, she began an affair with Raymond Reed, the store manager. Their secret relationship would soon set off a chain of events that would ultimately end in tragedy. In October 1973, James Taylor, Blanche's husband, died suddenly, with the cause of death reported as a heart attack. With James gone, Blanche and Raymond Reed began dating openly. But their relationship, too, would deteriorate over time. Their relationship seemed normal to outsiders, but Reed's health began to decline mysteriously in 1986. He was eventually hospitalized and died that October, with doctors diagnosing his death as a result of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Little did anyone suspect that poison was the real culprit. Blanche then became involved with Robert J. Hutton, the regional manager of the Kroger stores in the Piedmont Triad area. However, this relationship also ended badly, leading Blanche to file a sexual harassment lawsuit against Hutton and the store. The case was settled out of court for $275,000, and Hutton was forced to resign. And around the same time, Blanche accused an unknown person of setting 2 fires that damaged her mobile home, adding to the mystery surrounding her life. Blanche then met Reverend Dwight Moore, a divorced pastor. The two began a relationship, but Blanche had to keep it hidden. Her relationship with Dwight grew, and she even asked him to purchase arsenic-based ant killer, an innocent request, or so it seemed. Blanche and Dwight planned to marry, but their plans were delayed when Blanche was diagnosed with breast cancer in 1987. After multiple surgeries and a long recovery, the couple finally wed on April 19, 1989, and enjoyed a honeymoon in New Jersey. But their happiness was short-lived. Shortly after returning home, Dwight fell violently ill after eating a chicken sandwich that Blanche had given him. He was rushed to the hospital where his condition rapidly deteriorated. Doctors at North Carolina Memorial Hospital in Chapel Hill were puzzled by Dwight's symptoms. He had mentioned working with herbicides shortly after his honeymoon, raising concerns about possible poisoning. After consulting with toxicologists, doctors ordered a toxology screen, and the results were shocking. Dwight had 20 times the lethal dose of arsenic in his system, the highest amount ever recorded in a patient at the hospital. This revelation set off alarm bells, and investigators began to connect the dots between Dwight's illness and the deaths of Blanche's previous loved ones. Her father, first husband, and Raymond Reed revealed fatal levels of arsenic in their bodies, confirming what authorities had begun to suspect. Blanche Taylor Moore was not the grieving widow she appeared to be. She was, in fact, a cold-blooded killer. Blanche's arrest in 1989 sent shockwaves through North Carolina. Charged with first-degree murder of Raymond Reed, as well as the attempted murder of her second husband, Dwight Moore, Blanche was put on trial. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of a woman who used poison as her weapon of choice, quietly eliminating those who stood in her way. In 1990, Blanche was convicted of the murder of Raymond Reed and sentenced to death. While she has not formally been charged with the deaths of her father, her first husband, or even her mother-in-law, the evidence suggests that she may have been involved in their untimely deaths. To this day, she remains on death row, awaiting execution for her crimes. Blanche Taylor Moore's story is a reminder that evil can often wear the most ordinary of faces. Her ability to manipulate, deceive, and ultimately destroy the lives of those closest to her has left a lasting mark on the history of North Carolina. As she sits on death row, the full extent of her crimes may never be known, but the behavior of her actions will continue to send shivers down the spine of all who hear her name. For those who knew Blanche, the question remains: how did a woman like her turn into a killer? As experts and psychologists continue to study her case, one thing is certain: Blanche Taylor Moore will forever be remembered as one of America's most notorious killers. Her story is a dark chapter in the history of true crime. When questioned from his hospital bed, Dwight mentioned that Blanche's former lover, Raymond Reed, had died of Guillain-Barré syndrome, which presented symptoms similar to arsenic poisoning. This revelation prompted investigators to dig deeper into Blanche's past. Both Taylor and Reed's deaths were reclassified as homicides. Investigators also uncovered a toxicology report from Baptist Hospital, where Reed had been treated in 1986. The report, which had been overlooked due to a hospital error, showed high levels of arsenic in Reed's system, evidence that had gone unnoticed for years. In interviews with investigators, Blanche suggested that both Taylor and Reed had been depressed and might have poisoned themselves, a theory the authorities found implausible. Despite her efforts to evade suspicion, the evidence against her was mounting. On July 18, 1989, Blanche Moore was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the deaths of James Taylor and Raymond Reed. She was also charged with assault with a deadly weapon for the poisoning of Dwight Moore. While the charges related to Taylor and Dwight were eventually dropped, Blanche was sentenced to death for their murder of Raymond Reed. In October 1990, the quiet town of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, became the epicenter of a trial that would captivate the nation. Blanche Taylor Moore, a seemingly ordinary woman, stood accused of extraordinary crimes: the poisoning of her boyfriend, Raymond Reed, and the alleged involvement in the deaths of several others. The courtroom was packed and the atmosphere was tense as Moore faced charges for the murder of Raymond Reed. Despite the overwhelming evidence against her, Moore remained steadfast in her defense, adamantly denying that she had given Reed any food during his hospitalization. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. Over the course of the trial, the state called 53 witnesses to stand, witnesses who testified that Moore had indeed brought food to Reed while he was in the hospital. Their testimonies painted a picture of a woman who used her charm and trust to carry out her deadly plan. The prosecution's case against Moore was bolstered by a unique legal strategy. Reed's ex-wife and sons had filed a malpractice lawsuit against Baptist Hospital, where Reed had been treated. They argued that the hospital had failed to properly notify them of Reed's toxicology screen, which revealed the presence of arsenic in his system. Normally, the statute of limitations for wrongful death would have expired, but the Reed's family lawyer successfully argued that Moore, as the executor of Reed's estate, had fraudulently concealed the toxicology report. This legal argument allowed the Reed family to gather crucial evidence against Moore, evidence that would later be used in her criminal trial. While the Fifth Amendment protects defendants from self-incrimination, in criminal cases, those protections do not extend to civil cases. This distinction allowed the prosecution to build a stronger case against Moore, using evidence obtained through civil litigation. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Just 3 days later, on October 17th, the jury recommended the death penalty. The presiding judge agreed with the jury's decision, and on January 18, 1991, Blanche Taylor Moore was sentenced to die by lethal injection. Her conviction marked the end of a complex and grueling trial, but it was far from the end of Blanche's story. Blanche has resided at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. Despite the grim circumstances, she found ways to occupy her time. She has written music and poetry, channeling her emotions into a creative expression. Blanche's health has also deteriorated during her time in prison. She has undergone both chemotherapy and radiation therapy, battling cancer while awaiting her fate. Due to the automatic appeals process, Moore has managed to avoid execution for over 31 years. Through it all, Blanche Taylor Moore has maintained her innocence. She continues to assert that she was wrongfully convicted, despite the mountain of evidence against her. As Blanche Taylor Moore spends the remaining of her years on death row, her case serves as a reminder of the complexities of justice. The woman who once charmed her way through life now faces the ultimate punishment, her legacy forever entwined with the deaths of those who once trusted her. Whether Blanche will eventually face execution or die from natural causes remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: Blanche Taylor Moore's name will forever be etched in criminal history. Blanche's story is one of manipulation, deception, and cold-blooded murder. Beneath the guise of a devoted housewife, a mother, a churchgoer, she hid a deadly secret that would only come to light after years of tragedy. Her case is a chilling reminder of how even the most ordinary lives can conceal the darkest of intentions. As Blanche awaits her fate on death row, her crime continues to haunt those who knew her. My analysis. As a licensed mental health therapist, I've seen how deeply childhood trauma can shape a person's worldview, relationships, and coping mechanisms. Blanche's life was shaped by early trauma. It's an example of the profound psychological effects that can result from growing up in an abusive household. Blanche was the daughter of a Southern Baptist minister whose fire and brimstone sermons painted a picture of righteousness and moral authority. But behind closed doors, her father, Parker D. Kaiser, led a life of cruelty and control. His public persona masked a private reality where Blanche and her family endured the consequences of his addiction to alcohol and gambling. The emotional and physical abuse she experienced at the hand of her father left deep scars that would influence her relationships and view of the world. Blanche's early exposure to such profound dysfunction led her to leave home as soon as she could. But the psychological patterns established in childhood can be difficult to break. We often see survivors of abuse unconsciously seek out relationships that mirror their early experiences. In Blanche's case, it's possible that her choice in partners reflected a subconscious attraction to the familiar traits of control or volatility, much like her father. Her history with men is painted by violence and tragedy. Several of the men in Blanche's life met untimely deaths, raising questions. Were these men reminders of her father's cruelty? Was her resentment of her father unconsciously projected onto them? These are some of the complexities we consider in cases where unresolved trauma leads to destructive behavior. But it's important to note that not everyone who experiences childhood trauma turns to violence. Most people find ways to cope, to heal, and to break free from their past. But in Blanche's case, something shifted inside of her. Something snapped, leading her to believe that she could not only justify but also repeat the act of murder. Whether it was the culmination of unresolved trauma, a distorted sense of justice, or a deeper psychological break, we may never fully know. But what we do know is that Blanche's story speaks to the devastating impact of untreated trauma and the way it can spiral into tragic outcomes if left unchecked. While Blanche's descent into deadly behavior cannot be excused, they do illustrate the tragic consequences that untreated trauma can lead to. Blanche's story is not one of justification, but of understanding the devastating toll that years of unprocessed abuse can take on an individual's psyche. Blanche's childhood was marked by abuse at the hands of her father, a man who publicly portrayed himself as a righteous Southern Baptist preacher, but privately inflicted emotional, physical, and psychological harm on his family. The trauma Blanche experienced as a child, living in constant fear, being manipulated and controlled, likely shaped the way she saw the world in her relationships. We know that unresolved trauma can distort a person's ability to form healthy connections, manage emotions, and make sound decisions. It's impossible to say for certain how Blanche's life would have unfolded had she been given the opportunity to receive professional counseling. But we do know that when individuals are able to process their trauma with a trained therapist, they can begin to heal, gain insight into their behaviors, and develop healthier coping mechanisms. If Blanche had been able to confront and work through the pain and suffering she endured as a child, maybe she would have been able to break the cycle of violence and make different choices. Counseling could have provided her with the tools to manage her emotions, form safer relationships, and avoid the destructive path she ultimately took. However, we can only speculate. Blanche's story serves as a reminder that we cannot afford to ignore the effects of childhood trauma. Without intervention, unresolved trauma can manifest in destructive ways, sometimes hurting the individual, and in the most tragic cases, hurting others. My heart goes out to the families and loved ones of Blanche's victims, as well as to Blanche's own family. The pain they must endure is unimaginable, and I hope they find the space to grieve and process their loss, and eventually move forward. In sharing Blanche's story, my hope is to raise awareness about the importance of early intervention, trauma-informed care, and the critical role that mental health can support and play in preventing tragic outcomes like these.